Do, 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 do. Hmm?
Well, hello! Thank you. Thank you. You know, I worried I was late from my previous engagement. Now, I don't own a motor car, but to accelerate my arrival here, I accepted passage in one. Now, I have been a tramp abroad, an innocent abroad, roughing it around this globe. You didn't read them books either. No matter, no matter. I have widespread experience in my travels, and this is the only place in the whole world where the pavements consist exclusively of holes with asphalt around them. I have parts inside my torso I did not know existed after being jolted like that. Oh, now, I was guest of honor at a luncheon date where I was held captive by the Ladies of Silk and Satin Club, a reputable, benevolent society of ladies. Just ladies, because I was the only lady of my sex present. Now, I will admit I was spoiled and pampered and coddled with attention and compliments. And I hate that. You see, I feel they have not said enough. Now, particular scrutiny was squandered on my attire. My don't care dams, as I have so named this suit. This suit is the uniform of the ancient and honorable order of purity and perfection, of which organization I am president and secretary and treasurer and sole member. Now, I will add, I know of no other person who is eligible. Now, when a man gets to be my age, continuous sight of dark-colored clothing can have a depressing effect upon him. I know of nothing more hideous and disgusting in men's attire than the black clawhammer coat. Why, a group of men thus adorned remind me more of a flock of crows than anything else. Why shouldn't a man wear white? Light-colored clothing is more pleasing to the eye. It enlivens the spirit. And I believe we should do all we can to brighten things up. And you can't do that by wearing black funeral clothes. Huh? Now, I cannot compel everyone to dress as such just for my special benefit. So, I do the next best thing and wear it myself. Now, my luncheon date ladies of this afternoon, they are proud of their dress. Whew. A large part of the daughter of civilization is her dress. Well, as it should be. Some civilized women would lose half their charm without dress. And some would lose all of it. Now, I'm in favor of peekaboo waistlines and décolleté costumes. I certainly am. The most beautiful costume is the human skin. But since it is not polite nor convenient to wear that garb, I choose to wear white. Now, when the daughter of modern civilization dresses to her utmost best, it is a marvel of exquisite beauty and art and expense. Why, all the lands, all the climes are laid under tribute to furnish her forth. Why, her linen is from Belfast, her robe is from Paris, her lace is from Venice, or Spain, or France, her feathers from the remote regions of southern Africa, her furs from the remoter region of the iceberg and the aurora, or her bracelets from California, her cameos from Rome, her fan from Japan, her diamonds from Brazil, her pearls from Ceylon. Why, she has gems and trinkets from buried Pompeii, and others that once graced comely Egyptian forms that have been dust and ashes now for 40 centuries. Why, her watch, it's from Geneva. Her card case from China. Her hair from... I don't know. I don't know where her hair is from. I never could find out. Now, I am talking about her public hair. Her Sunday hair, not the hair she goes to bed with. Well, which reminds me of a trifle. Anytime you want, you can glance around a crowded carpet and go and pick up a hairpin. But to save your life, can you get any woman in that room to acknowledge her hairpin? Now, isn't that strange? But it's true. A woman who has never swerved from cast iron veracity and fidelity in her whole life will, when confronted with this crucial test, deny that hairpin. She will deny that hairpin before 100 witnesses. Are you to insinuate, Mr. Clemens, that I am wearing a wig? Hmm? Oh. Yeah, see, I've gotten into more hot water and trouble trying to hunt up the owner of a hairpin than by any other indiscretion in my life. Now, yet again, with that same cast iron resolve to deny a hairpin, a woman will use that same type of fortitude to her advantage in matters of reconciliation. For example, if a man wants a thing and his wife wants another thing, and they decide upon the thing that his wife wants, as they always do, that she calls a compromise. Now, verily, human intellect cannot estimate what we owe womankind. She sews on our buttons. She mends our clothes. She ropes us in at the church fairs. She confides in us. She tells us all she can find out about the little private affairs of the neighbors. She gives us good advice, and plenty of it. She soothes our aching brow. She bears our children. Well, ours as a general thing, you see, because when children misbehave, she says they're your children. But in all matters of life, it is but a just and honorable tribute to say of woman that she is a brick. Where would the people of earth be without women? Well, mighty scarce. Almighty scarce. So let us love her. Let us give her our support, our encouragement, ourselves, if she lets us. And it's about time. Let her vote. My mother had more common sense in her baby toe than most congressmen have in their massive egos. If woman had a vote today, she would use that whiplash, the ballot, and quickly rise up in her mind and change the awful state of things. It is just common sense to let women vote. But common sense, well, that's not so common. Now, in spite of women's grit and perseverance, she does suffer from one weakness. Oh, well, the poor creatures. They're awestruck by a man of my stature. I empathize and suffer with them. Now, in my defense, I offer up these dainty notes I've received from young women whom I've stricken with my destructive eye. Well, now eyes would have been more proper. You see, I generally bring down a couple at a time. Strabismus allows me to do that. Now, Valentine's Day always brings me an armful of these. These notes usually, they have pictures with them. And the handwriting is usually written in an execrable masculine hand. Now, the pictures and the handwriting are both intended to conceal the burning desires they have for me. Now, these new letters do not have any pictures. Why, they are of a different design and, well, very peculiar. Why, some of the more cautious young women have appended masculine names in place of their own in order to conceal their burning desires for me, but they fail. I have not lived 3/4 of a century for nothing. Now, well, it may be well enough to offer an example or two since their fashion is new. Box and plant undertakers. Mr. Clemens, sir, our metallic burial coffins have taken the premium at 6 state fairs. Parties who have used them have been in every instance charmed with them. Not one has yet entered a complaint. Our walnut and mahogany coffins are the delight of the people. We supply families at reduced rates. We would be glad to secure your custom and shall be greatly pleased to hear from you. Sincerely yours, Doug Graves. Well, I certainly do hope these parties can manage somehow to wait till they do hear from me, because I always did hate to be in a hurry in matters of this type of business. But really, Some girl's lacerated heart is under that deftly worded Valentine. All right. Here's another. Blister and carve patentees. Mr. Clemens, sir, our patent cancer eradicator arouses the admiration of all whose happy fortune it has been to be in a condition to use it. Nothing can withstand its enchanting influence. Excretions of all kinds upon the body disappear before it as by magic. If you have warts, if you have cancers, if you have a wen, come and be healed. We fervently hope to receive your custom. Sincerely, Lance Carbuncle. Well, I fervently hope you won't. Right now, I do not have any artificial attractions, such as wens and cancers and warts. I'm satisfied to remain homely. But really, this old Valentine is nothing but the transparent covering to some girl's breaking heart. Let it break. Mine has been broken often enough, and it don't hurt me. Once more. Peg and Hoop Proprietors. Sir, we beg to recommend to you our patent double-backed action chronometer balance incombustible wooden legs. You will find them superior to anything in the market. The dismantled soldiers of our beloved country are extravagant in their praises of them. Give them a trial. You cannot regret it. Be pleased to forward us your measure at once and let us furnish you with an outfit. Sincerely, Forrest Mills. Well, it pains me to decline, but I shall have to do it. I don't want any outfit. But what is it? These mysterious wooden legs so ingeniously conceal in reality. Blighted affection. It is hardly worthwhile for that young woman to try and fool me with her poor fraudulent wooden legs. I see through the flimsy ruse. Blighted affection is behind it. Now, the rest of these, they offer up tinware, gravestones, chewing gum, stationery, real estate, railroad literature, and a dozen other commodities. All so many veils wherewith to conceal the fatal admiration that is burning in the bosoms of the young women who send them. But this last one, I thought was fraught for a world of happiness for me. It says, sir, you better pay for your washing, Bridget. Oh, the pitiable young woman had been awash in heartbroken agony collecting my soiled garbs. I forfeited payment and never saw her again. Now, I surmise she had removed herself to unburden her anguish. Now, not all women are so fervently overcome owing to my quality. A modicum degree, an almost immeasurable and infinitesimal amount escape my charms. So I have been told. I know. Hard to believe, ain't it? I was born modest. Well, not all over, but in spots. And not all women receive benevolent reciprocation. There is one woman whom is a disgrace to all women. She is a malicious, malignant, vengeful, stingy, selfish, unforgiving, coarse, avaricious, furious blusterer on the outside and at heart a coward. Her presence would poison the entire vicinity. The Countess Massilia, if your curiosity beseeches, is the issue, the infected, saturated subject of my diatribe. Now, if I have not been perceptible, I don't like her. Now, to particularize, we had leased the Villa Reale di Quarto near Florence, Italy, from the Countess. She regretted her decision, and from the beginning she tormented my family in an attempt to get us to break the lease. Nothing seemed unimaginable in her attacks, from locking the main gate, preventing a doctor's urgent call. She shut off the water. She cut the phone lines. She had saturated 2 friendly dogs with kerosene oil so that the dog's joyous bounds would transfer the penetrating smell and oil. Well, she had a donkey that killed 2 men and bit off the thumb of another. It attacked my secretary. That donkey had more charm than that two-faced polecat Massilia. I swear the only possible way I could learn to like that woman would be on a raft at sea with no other provisions in sight. And only then with plenty of ketchup. She's a putrid disgrace, undeserving even a tittle more of my time. Except, I would postpone all recreations with news of her funeral and celebrate it. Speaking of two-faced, I have witnessed the wonderful two-headed girl on display in New England. She sings duets by herself. Now, this woman has 2 heads, 4 arms and 4 legs, but only 1 body. And she is, she, they. Oh, this is a conundrum. Is she her own sister? Is she twins? Having but 1 body, and consequently but 1 heart, is she strictly but 1 person? She does have a distinct advantage over the rest of her sex, for she never has to stop talking to eat. And I wonder, is there ever dissent in dinner choices? I want beefsteak. No, I want eggplant. When she's not eating, she keeps both tongues moving at the same time. And when she talks back and forth with her 2 mouths, is that a soliloquy? Does she need reservations for 2? I see immeasurable prospect for her. She need only buy 1 train ticket or theater seat. This double girl only has 1 name. Does she expect to have 1 vote or 2? Does she have the same opinion as herself on all subjects, or does she differ sometime? Can she be mad at herself? What happens if she were to get an itch in an inappropriate place, assuming, of course, only 1 side could reach the vexation and there has been disagreement? Are you going to scratch that? Only if we eat eggplant. Now, Was there blame as a child when she got caught in the sugar bowl?
It wasn't me. She's the culprit. No, she made me do it. She could play patty cake by herself. She has a lover.
And this lover is in a conundrum, for he can at one and the same moment be accepted by one mouth, but rejected by the other.
Come, beloved, give me a kiss.
Don't touch me, you despicable bonehead. Now, if he marries her, would he be guilty of bigamy? Would he have to take 2 vows? What would you tell the children?
Oh, for the last time, the head on the left is your mother. The one on the right is your aunt.
What if one head wanted a divorce? Oh, wow, this is hopeless. King Solomon would run for the hills. Would she be offended if she were to spit in her own face? Oh. Just at this moment, I feel compelled to drop this investigation, for it is rather too tangled for me. You know, it is interesting how we human beings have 2 sides, so to speak. One private, which we are afraid to express, and the other one, the one we use, which we force ourselves to wear until habit makes us feel comfortable in it, and the custom of defending it makes us love it, adore it, until we forget how pitifully we came by it. Well, look at it in politics. The loyal observance of private Christian morals has made this nation what it is: a clean and upright people in its private domestic life, and an honest and honorable people in its private commercial life. No alien nation can claim superiority over it in these regards. No critic, foreign or domestic, can challenge the validity of this truth. Yet, there are 2 types of Christian morals, one public and the other one private. And these 2 are so distinct and unfamiliar, they are no more akin than archangels and politicians. For 363 days of the year, the American citizen is true to his private Christian morals. But on the other 2 days, he puts away his private Christian morals and carries his public Christian morals to the polls and the tax office and does the best he can to damage and undo a whole year of faithful and righteous work. Well, without a blush, he will vote for an unclean boss if that boss is his party's Moses. Without compunction, he will vote against the best man in the whole land if he is on the other ticket. Look at the tyranny of party, and what is so-called party allegiance, party loyalty. A snare invented by designing men for selfish purposes that turns voters into chattel, slaves, rabbits. All the while their masters are shouting, they themselves are shouting rubbish about liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, honestly unconscious of the fantastic contradiction. And this mania to let the government have control over the private affairs of its citizens and cities is likely to cause endless trouble. There is great danger that our people will lose our independent thought and action, which in part is what makes us great, and slip into the helplessness of the Frenchman or the German who expects his government to feed him when hungry, clothe him when naked, and prescribe when he may be born and when he may die, and in fine, regulate the entire act of humanity from the cradle to the tomb, including the manner in which he may seek future admission into paradise. Now, every year, in cities and states across this nation, the public Christian puts corrupt men in office. Whereas if he'd put away his public Christian morals and carry his private Christian morals to the polls, he could promptly purify the public service and make the possessing of office a high and honorable distinction. We keep half of what we think hidden on the inside and deliver ourselves of that remnant of it which is proper for the general consumption. Now, I too, like all human beings, expose to the world only my trimmed, perfumed, and carefully barbered public opinion, and conceal carefully, cautiously, wisely my private ones. There are times when my feelings are so hot, I must take to the pen and pour them out on paper to keep them from setting me afire inside. I can't print the result. It would cause trouble for me and my loved ones. I can't do it. Oh, well, look, we have the privilege of free speech in America. Yes, well, as an active privilege, it ranks with the privilege to commit murder. We may exercise it if we're willing to take the consequences. Free speech in America, as in all countries, is confined to the dead. There is free speech in the grave. I will speak it from the grave. There is free speech there and no harm to the family. Contrarily, there are laws that protect the freedom of the press's speech, but none worth a damn to protect the public from the press. Why, it has become a sarcastic proverb that a thing must be true because, well, I read it in the newspaper. That is the opinion intelligent people have of that lying vehicle. But the trouble is, the stupid people, which constitute the grand overwhelming majority of this and all nations, they do believe. And they are convinced and molded by what they get from the press. Therein is where the problem lies. Well, let's investigate, shall we? The public's appetite, huh? We love to read about rich people. Mm-hmm. And the newspapers know this. So they do their best to keep that appetite liberally fed. Well, they'll even leave out a story about a reputable deed to make room for the headlines of, according to the display heading, Rich Woman Fell Down Cellar. The falling down the cellar means nothing to us if the woman were not rich. But no rich woman can fall down a cellar, and we not yearn to know everything about it and wish it were us. Oh, now, publicly, we scoff at titles and hereditary privilege, but privately, we hanker after them. And if we get a chance, we buy them for cash. Oh, and a daughter. And if we get them, why, the whole nation will publicly chaff and scoff, but privately envy. We want to like the higher and the better. Well, look at opera as an example. In America, opera is an affectation. The seeming love for it is a lie. 9 out of 10 men are bored by it, 5 out of 10 women. Yet how they applaud. Ignorant liars. They want to like the higher music because the higher and the better like it. They want to get into that upper tier, that dress circle, by a lie. So they pretend they like it. Now this lie, this pretense, gives to opera what support it has in America. I dislike is a better word, I dislike the word opera. 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 It sounds like a vetoed vegetable. Now, I have been to the opera whenever I could not help it. And I have endured several nights of suffering in its presence. Now, I know of no agony comparable. There doesn't often seem to be anything that anyone could call acting. As a general rule, you have a couple of people, one standing, and the other one with gestures best described as catching flies. All the while, this long, arid, head-aching, heartbreaking, sort of intense but incoherent noise bellows forth, which always so reminded me of the night the orphan asylum was burning down. Who likes entertainment like that? Huh? Liars. Now, we all have music and truth in us, but most of us just can't get it out. And note too also that venerable proverb that children and fools always tell the truth. Well, the deduction is plain. Adults and wise people never speak it. We are all liars. Why, we couldn't bear a habitual truth teller. None of us could live with such a creature. Perhaps I should offer an example or two. Imagine politicians in a debate. I am a hypocrite. My constituents are fools to vote for me. I intend to fill my pockets from the public coffers. My opponent is a better man. That is why I need your vote. Well, he may be a hypocrite, but I have successfully pickpocketed over 100 fools and have never been caught. Does this in me a better man make? Furthermore, I have several indictments against me, and I can promise you several more. Oh, casual encounters, acquaintances, they could bond as never before. Well, hello again, miss. You know, I must apologize to you. Last week I stated that you were the ugliest woman I had ever met. But I have since been visited by your sister and wish to withdraw that statement. Yes, a habitual truth teller simply is an impossible creature. He does not exist. He has never existed and he never will. Oh, now, I know. There are those of you who think you never lie. But it is not so. If you were interrupted by a stranger, or a friend or family member for that matter, you say with your hearty tongue, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you." But with your hearty soul, you say, "I wish it were dinner time and you were with the cannibals." And when they left, you say, "Oh, must you go?" and followed it with, "Call again." But your thought was, "My, how you annoy me. Next time I'll pretend I'm not home." But you did no harm. You did not deceive anyone, nor did you inflict any hurt. Whereas the truth would have made you both unhappy. If the iron-souled truthmonger were to manifest and even utter that he didn't want to see those people, he would be an ass and inflict a totally unnecessary pain. Therefore, courteous lying should be recognized and acknowledged as a sweet and loving art. Imagine newlyweds eating dinner.
My first attempt at chicken pudding. Do you like it?
It's delicious.
Oh, stop lying to me. You hate it. You boo-wah, boo-wah.
Now, see, his intentions were good, but he's uncultured in the art of lying. This same scenario with a cultured liar could reap rewards for the husband. The highest perfection of politeness is merely a beautiful edifice built from the base to the dome of graceful and gilded forms of charitable and unselfish lying. Lying is a necessity of our circumstances. It goes without saying that it is then a virtue. And no virtue can reach its highest usefulness without careful and diligent cultivation. Why, it then goes without saying it should be taught in the public schools, well, even in the newspapers. What chance has an ignorant, uncultured liar have against an educated expert? What chance do we have against a lawyer? Judicious lying is what this world needs. Let us do what we can to eradicate the prevalence of the brutal truth. The man who tells a lie to help some poor devil out of trouble is one whom the angels doubtless say, "Lo, here is an heroic soul who jeopardizes his own welfare to succor his neighbors. Let us insult this magnanimous liar." Now, an injurious lie is an uncommendable thing, and so too, and in the same degree, is an injurious truth, a fact that is recognized by the law of libel. We are creatures of falsehoods. My arguments have established these truths. So let us stop lying to ourselves and honestly embrace, cultivate, and refine one of our greatest natural characteristics, lying. Everybody lies every day, every hour, awake, asleep, in his dreams, in his joy, in his mourning. When our tongues are still, our eyes, our hands, our attitude convey deception. Even in the sermons. Well, that's a platitude. One of my dear friends, and an enemy on occasion, is the Reverend Joseph Twitzel. A good man, one of the best of men, in spite of his membership in the clergy. But I told him how we are all liars, and that even I am dishonest in some ways. Not many, but some. 41, I think it is. Yeah, 41. Now, I must tell you a story about the Reverend Joseph Twitchell. Sorry. Sorry. Now, years and years ago, Professor Norton of Harvard was near. Now, I went to call on him. Now, Professor Norton was allied in some way by marriage to Charles Darwin. Now, what he had to say was very gentle and almost delicate. And he said, Mr. Clemens, I have been spending some time in England with Mr. Darwin, and I should like to tell you something connected with that visit. You see, you were the object of it. Now, myself, I would be so very proud, but you may not be proud. At any rate, I'm going to tell you what it was and leave it to you to regard as you please. Now, Mr. Darwin had brought me up to his bedroom there, and he showed me various things, pictures, plants, and so on, that he was measuring and watering on a daily basis. And Mr. Darwin said, the chambermaid is permitted to do what she will up here, but she must never touch those plants, never touch those books on that shelf, for with those books, I read myself to sleep every night. Mr. Clemens, those were your very own books? Wow! I said, well, there is no question to my mind as to whether I regard that as a compliment or not. I do regard it as a very great compliment and a high honor that such a great mind, laboring for the whole human race, would rest itself upon my books? Wow! I am pleased he reads himself to sleep with them. Now, I could not keep that to myself. And as soon as I got home, well, I called up my dear friend and enemy, the Reverend Twitchell, and I told him all about the meeting with Professor Norton. And of course, why, he was full of interest and venom. People who get no compliments like that, well, they feel that way. Anyway, he went off. He did not issue any applause of any kind. And I never heard of that subject for quite some time. Now, when Mr. Darwin passed from this life, and soon thereafter his life and letters were published, well, the Reverend Twitchell had procured an early copy of that work, and he found something in it in which he considered applied to me. Now, he rushed right over, but it was a blizzard. Blinding snow, raging winds, but that did not matter to the Reverend Twitchell. Why, he produced the book and he turned over and over and over, and he came to a certain spot and he said, Here, read this letter from Charles Darwin to Sir Joseph Hooker. Now, what Darwin said, I just give you the idea and not the actual words, was this. I do not know whether I should have devoted my whole life to these drudgeries in the natural history and other sciences or not. For while I have gained in some ways, I have lost in others. Once I had a fine perception and appreciation for high literature. But in me, that quality has atrophied. That is the reason, said Reverend Twitchell, he is reading your books. I laugh every time I tell that story. oh, Joe. Now, well, now, reason, logic, reason validates the Reverend Twitchell's mild disgust for Darwin. Now, I too have scrutinized him and others on their theories of evolution. I don't know. Supposedly, well, you have this vast
vast variety of invertebrates in a primordial sea. And over the course of, 19 billion years, give or take a volcanic eruption and a few asteroids, why, they developed gradually and steadily into belemnites and encrinites, stalactites, blatherskites, one thing or another. A few are disappointments, and they die off and become extinct. Now, the Cambrian and the Archean periods creep on. Mountains form in the seas, and at long last, a cousin to the oyster is done. Now, the oyster, he has as much reasoning power as a scientist has, so he reckons he's going to stay in the soup to develop into a fish. So, the old Silurian seas are opened up to breed the fish in. Millions of years passes, and theoretically, 10,000 kinds of fishes have developed from the oyster. But we have raised nothing but fossils and extinctions. But somehow, one manages to stay around long enough to develop into something else. Now, they cross these all up, and you fetch out a reptile. Why, several million more years pass, and you get lizards, alligators, horny toads, congressmen. Now you cross these all up again, and you fetch out a plant of amphibians, half-breeds that do business on land and water, such as frogs, turtles, ornithorhynchuses. Now, you cross them all up again, and you get a pterodactyl. After a few more ice ages and asteroids more, you have a whole slew of winged creatures. Now, you cross the entire animal kingdom to date, mix it all up, pull out a mammal. Start diluting in again, till you get rats and tigers and cows and elephants, and at long last, the monkey. Man's not far off now. Now the monkey, he goes on developing for nigh upon 5 million years, and crosses up with the missing link. Now, a few great minds theorize the Frenchman is that connecting link. And there you are, a man, all shipshape and finished up, nothing to do now but wait and see if it was worth the time and expense. Well, was it? See, my mind says man is lower than the animals. God probably created the monkey because he's disappointed in man. I mean, after all, man was created at the end of the week when God was tired. But man is a cruel animal. Man has a passion for revenge. He's the only one that deals in the atrocity of atrocities, war. He is the only slave. He's the only animal that enslaves. He's the only one that loves his neighbor as himself and cuts his throat if his theology isn't straight. Why, man will pave a road with cadavers to smooth his brother's path to heaven. Such is the human race. You know, oftentimes it seems like such a pity that Noah and his party did not miss the boat. You should hear the dinner conversations the Reverend Twitchell and I have when we meet. He's usually got a belly full before the appetizers are served. But man is the reasoning animal. Such is the claim. I think it's open for dispute. You see, Adam did not have enough reasoning power to put clothes on until he learned he was naked. But now this realization did bring death into the world. And anyone who has lived long enough to know what this life is knows what a debt of gratitude we owe Adam for bringing death into the world. But it also brought moral sense. That sense that puts man above the beast instead of below the beast. And man, through the ages, has cultivated moral sense to be both public and private. What a marvel man is! Why, man can do all things but one. He cannot have a hole in the seat of his britches and keep his fingers out of it. If I were to write, she was stark naked, and then proceed to describe in detail her person, why, the public moral critics would howl. Who would venture to leave such a book on their parlor table? I'll just take it behind this closed door over here. Yeah, he'll be happy to read it behind a closed door. But you see, the artist does this. That is to say, he paints or sculpts nudity. And all ages gather round. And they look and, talk and, point, You see, I can't say they cut his head off and then proceed to describe the blood and the agony in his face without some editor removing all the appetizers before the banquet. I hate editors. They make me waste a lot of perfectly good English words. They are conceited, and they are full of envy and malice, and they don't pay enough. How we remember with regret that Napoleon had once shot at a magazine editor and missed him and killed a publisher instead. But we remember with charity that his intentions were good. You see, I had started my own publishing company, well, in part to eliminate the censorship from the editors, only to have much of my work banned. Now, in my capacity as a publisher, I recently received a manuscript from a school teacher with answers to questions propounded to her pupils, and I never could give a good impromptu speech without several hours to prepare for it. Here we go. All right. Now, yep. All right. Now these answers show that the children had nothing but the sound to go by. The sense of the word was perfectly empty. And well, here are some words that the children were asked to define.
auriferous, pertaining to an orifice. Yeah, all right. Ammonia, the food of the gods. Equestrian, one who asks questions. Parasite, a kind of umbrella. Ipecac, a man who likes a good dinner. And here's a definition of an ancient word honored by a great party. Republican, a sinner mentioned in the Bible. And here's an innocent deliverance of a zoological kind. There are a good many donkeys in the theological gardens. Now on this one here, this definition is very good in its own way. Demagogue, a vessel containing beer and other liquids. Now here too is a composition from a boy about girls, which I must say I rather like. Girls are very stuck up and dignified in their manner and behavior. They think more of dress than anything and like to play with dolls and rags. They cry if they see a cow in a far distance and are afraid of guns. They stay at home all the time and go to church every Sunday. They are always sick. They are always furry and making fun of boys' hands. And they say, how dirty. They can't play marbles. I pity them poor things. They make fun of boys and then turn around and love them. I don't believe they ever killed a cat or anything. They look out every night and say, oh, ain't the moon lovely? There is one thing I have not told, and that is they always know their lesson better'n boys. Now this boy, I believe, has a future as a novelist and a humorist. All he needs to succeed is ignorance and confidence. Now you can see that he is on the right track, for his composition shows that he will not allow schooling to interfere with his education. Now, if he cultivates himself with diverse travels and persuades others of his genius, the horse race is won. You see, my travels always gave me a plethora of anecdotes to chew on. But some I even wrote about. When I was in Paris, they simply opened their eyes and stared when I spoke to them in French. I never was successful in making those idiots understand their own language. Oh, and then they pretend like they speak English. Well, that is, they speak it, but on the European plan. You see, they can speak it, but they can't understand it. They think they do, but they don't. It is next to impossible to phrase an English sentence in such a way as to have them comprehend it. Now, I recall a conversation with a waiter. Now, when I realized that he could not comprehend what I was saying, well, that's when I exposed him to my party. But now, no harm came to him in his ignorance, but we were entertained. And it went like this. Excuse me, can you tell me where these oranges are from? What country are they from? More you like? No, I bring them. Oh, no, I do not wish to have any more. I only wish to know what country they are from.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Yes, I mean, they are very, very nice. Oh, nice, 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 yes. I mean, they are firm and juicy, and they're delicious. Can you tell me what country they are from? Oh, yes, yes. What region? What region? Oh, yes, yes. Now, is it true that your mother is a prostitute and there's considerable doubt as to who your father is? Oh, yes, yes. And I have heard it said that the French define virtue as a woman who don't steal and who has only one lover. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, and you know, if you were to bathe once in a while your customers might stay longer, they wouldn't leave so fast anymore. More, you like? No, I bring them. And with that, he bowed and retired, perfectly content with himself. It has always been a marvel to me, the French language. It's always been a puzzle to me how the French, with their animalistic public indecencies and their lack of sociability, have that beautiful language. Oh, how expressive it is, how eloquent, and limpid. I am always fooled. I always think I'm going to understand it. But, like German, I speak it best through an interpreter. Now, German. A person can learn the German language if he has 30 years to spare. The art and mastery of the Germanic language enables a man to travel all day in one sentence without changing cars. Some German words are so long that they have a perspective. Observe this word. All right, then. We'll start in Berlin. Generalstabsverordnetenversammlungen. And we arrive at Ellis Island. Generalstabsverordnetenversammlungen. Now, this translates meetings of the legislature. Unfortunately, the meeting has long been over by the time you're finished reading the announcement. This is not a word. This is an alphabetic procession, complete with marching bands and confetti. You see, I long ago gave up trying to learn the German language. I recall years ago when I was still endeavoring to learn the German language, we were entertaining a family one night whose daughter was similar in age to our daughter. And upon their arrival, I greeted them in German by saying, "Good evening," which is to say, "Guten Abend." The child had clung to her father's leg and whispered, "That man needs his mouth washed out with soap." Well, so it has since become a favorite expletive of mine. Where is my Guten Abend pen? Eureka! I'm a Guten Abend genius. Ah, those Guten Abend politicians. Now, I am certain in early times, some sufferer with a toothache had to stay up. So he put the time in inventing the German language. And it must have been before dentistry was invented, you see, because a good dentist
would have extracted the adjectives that, when spoken by me, bring my modesty under suspicion. Why do dentists ask questions with their instruments buried in your mouth? It is next to impossible to form a consonant with your mouth full of dental instruments. Now, the English response to a trained ear can be understood. For example, the dentist says, "Did you feel that?" "Hmm." "Well, I'm sorry, I'll be more careful." But in German, "it hurt" is "das tut weh." But in the dentist chair, it becomes displeasure is certain and validated by that dentist's fallacious smile. Now, my dentist, he has that calm, possessed, surgical look of a man who can endure pain in another person. Now, those who learn early the right way to choose a dentist have their reward. All dentists talk while they work. The one that talks well, other things being equal, is the right one to choose. You see, he will tell anecdotes that are so interesting and entertaining that you hardly notice the flight of time. But not only will he tell anecdotes that are interesting in themselves, but he will add nice shadings to them with his instruments. Now, it is important to note that he has uncovered down in there a nerve that he visits at intervals according to the needs of his story. He might say, "We were in a canoe. The winds came up, thrashing the waves over the canoe." Oh, he touches the nerve very lightly, swiftly. All the while, he's gradually and steadily building up toward his climax with a build in consummate art. And suddenly, the spindle stops thundering and whirling in the cavity, and you know that the grand surprise is imminent. You can hear your heartbeat as the dentist bends over you with his voice diminished to a murmur. "We were afraid the canoe would capsize." The suspense grows bigger, and bigger. Your heart stops, then your breath. The dentist says, "The lightning burst all around us. He dropped into that raw nerve." The most spectacular surprises of the theatrical stage are pale and artificial compared with that. Find a dentist like that. You won't regret it. Well, I recommend one who does leave your jaw intact. We all postpone our dental and physician visits until we can no longer betray ourselves. And then when we force ourselves to go, well, we feel like school children being scolded by a stingy old schoolmarm. Don't eat that. Don't drink that. Don't smoke. So they tell you the only way that you can be healthy is to eat what you don't want, drink what you don't like, and do what you'd rather not. Well, that's like paying your whole fortune for a cow that's gone dry. Now, I have stopped smoking. It is the easiest thing in the world to do. I know. I've done it thousands of times.
I recall one time I was trying to write during one of my attempts at healthy reformation, and the deprivation of smoking caused me to be seriously obstructed, and not one drop of milk could be squeezed from my brain's teat. Now, you see, I learned long ago the rewarding pleasure I get when I return to a vice always paid me in full for every second of aggravation it caused during its absence. So, I have given it up. That is to say, I have given up trying to give up the unhealthy things that give me great pleasure. I came to realize that abstinence is a good thing. And in my passion for it, I totally abstain from total abstinence. Now, I live by these vows now. I vow to never smoke more than one cigar at a time. I vow to never smoke while asleep and never cease while awake. If as a house guest I must smoke surreptitiously while all others are asleep, and if the family detects the unfamiliar odor, I vow to bring suspicion upon the cat in order to save my reputation. If something tastes good, I will eat it. And I will drink to excess if necessary. Oh, now, please, don't you emulate me. You see, you cannot get to old age by another man's road. My ways protect me, but they would assassinate you. Don't let them say of you, woe unto you, for you have gone the way of twain. And now, before I go, I would like to offer some advice to the children. Always obey your parents when they are present. And don't go around thinking that the world owes you a living. It owes you nothing. You want to know why? It was here first. Now, boys, you ought never to take anything that don't belong to you if it's too big to carry off. And don't do some evil deed and lay it on your brother when it's just as convenient to lay it on some other poor kid. And girls, you ought never to sass old people. Well, unless they sass you first. And always obey your superiors, if you have any. And don't smoke to excess, don't drink to excess, and don't marry to excess. Now, parents, my advice for a child that has constant fits is to soak it, the child, in a barrel of rainwater overnight. Now, if that does not put a stop to its fits, then leave it in there a week. We were lecturing, traveling the world lecturing, traveling the globe to cure a debt. When my wife and one of my daughters had started across the ocean to bring to England our eldest daughter. She was 24 and in the bloom of young womanhood, and we were unsuspecting. When my wife and daughter had reached mid-Atlantic, my wife
has since passed from this life. When my wife and daughter had reached mid-Atlantic, a cablegram was put into my hand, one of those horrible cablegrams that we must all endure at some point in our lives. And it stated that daughter of ours had gone to her long sleep. And so, as I say, I cannot always be jovial. I cannot always be chaffing. I must sometimes lay down the cap and bells and recognize that I too am of the human race and must suffer its pains and its consequences. But I have since have received hundreds of letters from all sorts of people, men, women, children, and in these letters is praise and compliment. And most of all, and best of all, is affection. Praise is good, compliment is good, but affection, that is the single most and best reward any man could earn. And whether by accomplishment or by character, I am very proud to have received that reward. You see, all those letters, and you let me know that wherever I go, I am not alone. I am not an alien, but I'm home. I bid you good night. Oh. Ah, guten Abend. Oh.